August 29, 1776. Brooklyn, New York. 3 a.m. In the darkness, 9,000 American soldiers are trapped. Behind them, the East River, a mile of freezing water with no boats. In front of them, 20,000 British troops preparing for a dawn assault that will annihilate the Continental Army. Above them, the fog is lifting. In 4 hours, the sun will rise and reveal their position. The American Revolution will be over before it truly began. General George Washington stands at the water's edge, facing an impossible choice: surrender and end the rebellion, or attempt an escape so desperate, so improbable, that even suggesting it seems like madness. What happens in the next 9 hours will determine whether America becomes a nation or remains a colonial footnote. This is not the story you learned in school. This is not the tale of Valley Forge or Yorktown. This is the story of a single night when everything hung by a thread so thin that historians still marvel that it didn't snap. This is the night Washington almost lost the war, and the extraordinary sequence of miracles, mistakes, and sheer audacity that saved it. To understand how desperate this moment was, we need to rewind 6 weeks. July 4, 1776. The Declaration of Independence is signed in Philadelphia. 13 colonies have just declared war on the most powerful empire on earth. The British response is overwhelming and immediate. General William Howe arrives in New York Harbor with the largest expeditionary force Britain has ever assembled: 32,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, 400 transport ships, and 73 warships. The most powerful navy in the world. Against them, George Washington commands roughly 19,000 troops. Most are farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers with almost no military training. They have no navy. They have limited ammunition. They have never fought a major battle. Washington makes a catastrophic strategic error. He splits his army. He stations half on Manhattan Island and half across the East River in Brooklyn, trying to defend both positions simultaneously. Military commanders for centuries have known this as a fatal mistake. A divided force can be defeated in detail. The British recognize the opportunity immediately. On August 22, Howe lands 15,000 troops on Long Island. His plan is brutally simple: crush the Brooklyn force, then use his naval superiority to prevent any escape across the river. The Americans will be trapped with their backs to the water. It's a textbook annihilation strategy. August 27, 1776. 9 a.m. The Battle of Brooklyn begins. And it's a slaughter. Washington has positioned his troops along the heights of Guan, a ridge of hills he believes will protect Brooklyn. But his intelligence is catastrophically wrong. There's a secret pass through the hills called Jamaica Pass, and the Americans have left it virtually unguarded. The British discover it. At dawn, 10,000 British soldiers march through Jamaica Pass in complete silence. By the time the Americans realize what's happening, the British are behind them. The Continental Army is caught in a massive pincer movement, British troops attacking from the front and rear simultaneously. The Americans break and run. It's not a battle. It's a rout. Men throw down their weapons and flee. Officers lose control of their units. The Maryland 400, an elite regiment, makes a desperate stand to buy time for others to retreat, charging British positions again and again. Only 12 of them survive. By noon, it's over. The Americans have lost over 1,000 men killed or captured. British casualties, fewer than 400. The surviving American forces retreat to a fortification in Brooklyn Heights, right at the water's edge. And then the British make a decision that changes everything. They stop. General Howe orders his troops to dig in and prepare for a siege rather than pressing the attack. Why? The memory of Bunker Hill haunts him, a battle where the British won but suffered 40% casualties charging American fortifications. Howe is cautious. He'll surround the Americans, bombard them with artillery, and force a surrender. No need to risk another bloodbath. He doesn't realize that his caution has just given Washington a chance. August 28. Washington calls an emergency council of war in Brooklyn Heights. His officers gather in a small farmhouse while British artillery pounds their positions. The situation is catastrophic. They're trapped on a narrow peninsula. The British control all land routes. The Royal Navy controls the water. Food is running out. Ammunition is running out. Rain is pouring down, ruining the gunpowder that remains. Morale is shattered. Some officers argue for immediate surrender to prevent a massacre. Others want to make a final stand, go down fighting. Washington says nothing. He's been awake for over 40 hours. His carefully planned defense of New York has collapsed in a single day. Everything he's built, the Continental Army, the revolution itself, is about to be captured or destroyed. And then Washington makes the decision that will define his entire career. He doesn't surrender. He doesn't make a last stand. He decides to do something that has almost no historical precedent: evacuate an entire army across a mile of open water, at night, in silence, while surrounded by enemy forces on 3 sides. His officers stare at him. The plan is insane. To evacuate 9,000 men, plus artillery, supplies, and horses, they'll need hundreds of boats they don't have. They'll need perfect weather conditions. They'll need the British to not notice thousands of men moving to the shore. They'll need absolute silence, a single musket shot, a single shouted order, and the alarm will be raised. And they'll need to complete the entire operation in one night. If the sun rises before the evacuation is complete, the Royal Navy will move into the East River and trap the boats mid-crossing. Every soldier will be killed or captured. Washington knows all of this. He orders the evacuation to begin at nightfall. Washington needs boats. Lots of them. Immediately. He sends urgent orders to Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment, fishermen and sailors from Massachusetts, some of the only men in the Continental Army who actually know how to handle boats. Glover commandeers every vessel he can find: rowboats, sailboats, ferries, cargo barges. Anything that floats. By evening, they've assembled a ragtag fleet of perhaps 60 vessels. It's not nearly enough. A single large transport could hold 100 men. Most of these boats hold 20 or 30 at most. The math is brutal. 9,000 men divided by 30 men per boat equals 300 trips. Even under perfect conditions, that's impossible in one night. But Washington has no choice. At 8 p.m., as darkness falls, the evacuation begins. The operation is coordinated with extraordinary precision. Regiments are pulled from the fortification in carefully staged rotations, just enough to man the defenses if the British attack, but allowing steady movement to the shore. The men are ordered to absolute silence. No talking. No lights. Boots wrapped in cloth to muffle footsteps. Artillery wheels wrapped in rags to prevent creaking. Officers communicate through whispered messages passed hand to hand. The first boats push off into the darkness. The East River current is treacherous, strong tides that can flip boats or sweep them miles off course. But Glover's Marblehead men are expert sailors. They know how to read currents, how to navigate in darkness. Boat by boat, load by load, they ferry men across. 20 minutes to row to Manhattan. 10 minutes to unload. 20 minutes to row back. Again and again and again. Incredibly, the British don't notice. All night, thousands of men are moving to the shore, boarding boats, crossing the river. And the British, camped less than a quarter-mile away, hear nothing. How is this possible? First, the weather. The rain that had been falling all day has turned the ground to mud. British patrols find movement difficult and uncomfortable. They stay in their tents. Second, American deception. The remaining troops in the fortification keep campfires burning. Sentries call out passwords loudly, creating the illusion of a fully manned position. Third, British overconfidence. Howe is certain the Americans are trapped. His naval commanders have assured him the East River is too dangerous to cross at night. There's no rush. The Americans will still be there in the morning. But there's a fourth factor, and it's pure luck. A loyalist woman, historians believe her name was Mrs. Rapelye, discovers the evacuation. She sees soldiers moving toward the river. She realizes what's happening. She rushes to British lines to sound the alarm. She reaches a Hessian commander and tells him the Americans are escaping. The Hessian looks at her, assumes she's confused or hysterical, and sends her away. The warning never reaches British command. How many times in history has everything hinged on one person being dismissed? The evacuation continues. By midnight, roughly 3,000 men have crossed. But that means 6,000 still remain. And the night is half over. 2:00 a.m. Disaster. The wind shifts. Until now, Glover's men have been able to use sailboats to ferry troops, faster and more efficient than rowing. But the wind has been blowing from the northeast, perfect for crossing. Suddenly, it dies completely. Then it reverses, blowing from the south. The sailboats are useless. Everything now depends on rowboats. The pace of evacuation slows by half. Washington does the math. At the current rate, there's no way to evacuate everyone before sunrise. Sunrise is at approximately 5 a.m. That's 3 hours away. 6,000 men still need to cross. It's impossible. Officers approach Washington, begging him to save himself. Get in a boat now while there's time. Leave the army, preserve the commander, rebuild later. Washington refuses. He will be the last man to leave. If the army is captured, he will be captured with them. Meanwhile, on the British side, there are signs that something is wrong. Sentries notice the American campfires seem dimmer. The sounds from the fortification seem quieter. Patrols report unusual movement. But no one puts it together. No one believes the Americans would attempt something so audacious. By 4 a.m., Washington knows he's out of time. There are still thousands of men on the Brooklyn shore. The eastern sky is beginning to lighten. In less than an hour, the sun will rise. And then something happens that no one can explain. A fog rolls in. 4:30 a.m. A dense fog blankets the East River. It's not a light mist. It's a thick, impenetrable wall of fog that reduces visibility to just a few feet. British sentries literally cannot see their own hands in front of their faces. And here's what makes it miraculous. The fog appears on the Brooklyn side, but not on the Manhattan side. The Marblehead sailors can see where they're going as they approach Manhattan, but the British can't see the boats leaving Brooklyn. Meteorologists have studied the conditions of that night. A fog this dense, this localized, this perfectly timed is extraordinarily rare. The combination of temperature, humidity, and wind patterns had to align precisely. Some historians call it luck. Others call it providence. Soldiers on both sides called it a miracle. Washington seizes the opportunity. He orders the evacuation to continue at maximum speed. Boats shuttle back and forth through the fog. Entire regiments wade into the water and climb aboard. The last artillery pieces are rolled onto barges. The pace is frantic now. No more careful staging, just get everyone across. By 6 a.m., the last boat is loading. Washington himself steps aboard. Behind him, campfires still burn in the abandoned fortification. The fog is beginning to lift. And as Washington's boat reaches the Manhattan shore, the fog dissipates completely. Sunlight breaks through. British officers in Brooklyn Heights look toward the fortification and see nothing. The Americans are gone. The entire army has vanished. The British response is stunned disbelief. Howe immediately sends troops into the abandoned American fortification. They find campfires still smoldering. They find supply depots nearly empty. They find fortifications unmanned. But no army. How did 9,000 men disappear? British commanders scramble to understand what happened. They send ships into the East River, but the Americans are already landing on Manhattan. They question prisoners, who confirm the impossible. The entire Continental Army crossed the river in a single night. Military historians still consider this one of the most successful retreats in military history. The Dunkirk evacuation in World War II, where 340,000 Allied troops escaped from France, took 9 days and involved thousands of boats. Washington evacuated 9,000 men in 9 hours with 60 boats. And he did it silently, at night, under the noses of a superior enemy force. But here's the question that haunts historians. Why didn't the British pursue more aggressively? Howe had the ships. He had the men. He could have landed troops on Manhattan and trapped Washington again. Instead, he paused. Again. Some historians argue Howe was incompetent, too cautious, too slow. Others suggest something darker, that Howe sympathized with the American cause and deliberately allowed Washington to escape. Howe had many friends in America. He'd spoken against the war in Parliament. Was he secretly hoping for a negotiated peace rather than total American defeat? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that his hesitation gave Washington time to retreat further to regroup, to survive. But survival didn't mean victory. The retreat from Brooklyn was brilliant, but the strategic situation was still catastrophic. Washington had saved his army, but he'd lost New York. Over the next 3 months, the British would push the Continental Army out of Manhattan, across New Jersey, and into Pennsylvania. By December 1776, Washington's force had shrunk from 19,000 to fewer than 3,000. Men deserted in droves. Enlistments expired. Supplies ran out. The revolution was on the verge of collapse. Thomas Paine, embedded with the army, wrote, "These are the times that try men's souls." The cause seemed lost. And yet, Washington had bought time. Time to plan. Time to rebuild. Time to strike back. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington would cross the Delaware River and attack Trenton, a victory that revived American morale and changed the trajectory of the war. But Trenton never happens without Brooklyn. If Washington had been captured in August, the revolution ends. There is no Trenton, no Saratoga, no French alliance, no Yorktown. The entire chain of events that leads to American independence depends on those 9 hours on the night of August 29th. One decision. One fog. One miracle. And here's what's remarkable: Washington never took credit for it. In his official reports, he described the retreat as a necessary movement and credited his officers and men. He never mentioned the fog. He never framed it as a miraculous escape. Perhaps he understood that admitting how close they'd come to total disaster would be too demoralizing. Or perhaps he knew that great leadership sometimes means making people believe that survival was inevitable, even when it was anything but. Let's play the game historians hate but can't resist. What if the fog never appeared? What if the wind hadn't shifted back? What if the British had pursued aggressively the next morning? What if that loyalist woman's warning had been taken seriously? Any one of these changes, and the Continental Army is captured or destroyed in Brooklyn. George Washington is either killed or taken prisoner. And then what? The revolution doesn't end immediately. Other generals could have taken command. But Washington was irreplaceable, not because he was a brilliant tactician, but because he was a symbol. He held the army together through sheer force of will and moral authority. Without Washington, the Continental Army likely fractures into regional militias. The French never intervened. They were waiting to see if the Americans could actually win battles before committing resources. The revolution sputters out by 1778, maybe 1779. The Declaration of Independence becomes a historical curiosity. The 13 colonies remain British. And the course of world history changes entirely. No United States means no Louisiana Purchase. No westward expansion. No Mexican-American War. The entire North American continent develops differently. The French Revolution might still happen, but without American inspiration and without American proof that revolution against a monarchy can succeed. The world wars of the 20th century would look completely different without American intervention. All of it, all of modern history, pivots on 9 hours in August 1776. On one commander's desperate gamble and a fog that appeared exactly when it was needed. But let's talk about the real miracle. Not the weather, but Washington's decision to attempt the retreat at all. Military academies still study this operation because it violates almost every principle of warfare. You don't evacuate an army under enemy fire. You don't attempt a water crossing while surrounded. You don't risk your entire force on a single desperate gambit. The conventional military wisdom is to surrender. Preserve your army. Negotiate favorable terms. Live to fight another day. Washington had no reason to believe the retreat would succeed. The odds were impossibly stacked against him. Any rational analysis says it fails. Boats capsize, men drown, the British detect the movement and attack. And yet he tried anyway. Why? Because Washington understood something deeper than military tactics. He understood that the revolution was as much a psychological phenomenon as a military one. If the Continental Army surrendered in Brooklyn, the message to every colonist would be, resistance is futile. British power is overwhelming. Give up. But if the army escaped, even in retreat, even in defeat, the message was different. We're still fighting. We're still alive. The cause continues. Washington was willing to risk everything on that message. And it worked. When news of the Brooklyn escape spread through the colonies, it wasn't reported as a defeat. It was reported as a miraculous deliverance. Washington became a symbol of American resilience, of refusing to accept the impossible. History remembers Washington. But the real heroes of that night were Colonel Glover's Marblehead Regiment. These weren't professional soldiers. They were fishermen, tough, weathered New Englanders who'd spent their lives working boats. They rowed for 9 hours straight. Their hands blistered, then bled. Their shoulders screamed. They navigated treacherous currents in absolute darkness. They made trip after trip after trip, knowing that if they were caught, they'd be killed or captured just like the soldiers they were rescuing. 20 years later, when Washington was president, he made a special trip to Marblehead to thank the survivors. He told them that without their efforts that night, there would be no United States of America. It's one of the few times Washington publicly acknowledged how close the revolution came to ending before it began. Most of the Marblehead men are forgotten now. No monuments. No textbooks mention their names. But every American owes them a debt that can never be repaid. They saved the revolution with nothing but oars and determination. Today, if you stand on Brooklyn Heights and look across the East River toward Manhattan, you can see exactly what Washington saw that terrible night. The distance doesn't look that far, just a mile. On a clear day, you can see every building, every street. It looks crossable. Easy, almost. But stand there at night. Watch the current. Feel the wind. Imagine doing it with 9,000 men, 60 boats, and an army hunting you. Imagine making the decision that everything, every principle, every hope, every life, depends on one desperate gamble. That's the night we almost lost the war. The night that should have ended the American Revolution before it truly began. The night that was saved by courage, by luck, by a fog that came from nowhere and changed everything. Washington would go on to win the war. He would become the first president. His face would be carved into mountains. But he was never closer to complete destruction than that August night in Brooklyn. And he was never greater than the moment he decided not to surrender, but to fight for one more day. That decision, that refusal to accept defeat, became the DNA of the nation that followed. This was the night Washington almost lost the war. But instead, he taught America how to survive the impossible.